Golf Central on YouTube is brought to you by the new Chrome Tour golf ball from Callaway.
The PGA Tour in Charlotte this week, the birthplace of the late Charlie Sifford. Sifford was the first black PGA Tour member in the early 1960s, facing seemingly unsurmountable obstacles during the early civil rights era, but he did have some help from a California attorney named Stanley Mosk.
So Stanley said to me one day, he said, Charlie said, man, if you play like this next week, you're going to win the tournament. I said, what tournament? He said, the PGA. I said, oh, man, they ain't going to let me play in no PGA. So he said, why? I said, man, don't you see I'm a black man? He said, what difference does that make? I said, Stanley, in the Constitution and bylaws of professional golf, it stated only Caucasians become members of the Professional Golf Association. He said, oh, no, man. I don't believe that. I said, okay, we're going to play tomorrow. So when we go out to the golf course the next day, you understand, I had it and I showed it to him. So he said, no. This is not going to happen. He said, will you stand by me? I said, yeah, I'll stand by you.
Peter May spent more than 4 decades as a sports writer for the New York Times, ESPN, and the Boston Globe, among others. Earlier this year, he wrote a book about Sifford's journey and the influence of Stanley Mosk. It's called Changing the Course, How Charlie Sifford and Stanley Mosk Integrated the PGA. We welcome Peter May to Golf Central. Peter, thanks for being here. Let me ask you first, what motivated you to write this story about Sifford and Mosk?
Partly it was because the Caucasian-only clause, I felt, had never been really seriously investigated as to why it was there and why it was so hard to remove. And I always found that if you're talking about an issue like that, it's always best to tell it through the stories of individuals. And Charlie Sifford was the prominent black golfer of his time who fought this, and Stanley Mosk was the Attorney General of California who threatened the PGA and browbeat the PGA into eventually dropping the clause, which he rightly called an obnoxious restriction in 1961.
Interesting note about this time period, the boxer Joe Louis was enormously popular in this era, so much so that he was often invited to play golf at courses that were restricted, as you put it. What can you tell us about Lewis's influence in setting the tone for the eventual relaxing of the color barrier?
Well, he was, as you mentioned, he was enormously popular, and he was a very good golfer as well. So it wasn't that the PGA tournaments didn't want him for just his star power. They wanted him because he was a good player. But Joe Louis also bankrolled a lot of the black golfers behind the scene and under the table and over the table. One of those was Ted Rhodes, who Charlie Sifford always thought was the best black golfer of his time, but he never had the chance to do what Charlie did. But Joe Louis bankrolled him, made him his personal coach, and he did so with another black pro as well. So Joe Louis and Billy Eckstein, the great band leader and singer, were the two prominent black celebrities of their time who bankrolled these golfers. And Charlie Sifford was on Billy Eckstein's payroll for about 10 years. So they were the two. But Joe was the golfer. Billy became a good golfer because Charlie taught him. Joe was a terrific player as well.
And that was my next question, the jazz artist, Billy Eckstein. Yeah. What, other than bankrolling certain athletes, what else did he do to influence the change?
Well, basically, he brought his band to places, and, it was mainly with Charlie. He put Charlie on his payroll for $150 a week. And he was mindful of the fact that wherever he played, south of the Mason-Dixon line, which was where a lot of the good golf was, he couldn't stay in those ballrooms where he played, and Charlie couldn't either. So they had to always find places to stay, or they would drive through the night after a show to another place. So Billy Eckstein was really, he was a supporter of what was known then as the UGA, the United Golfers Association, which was the organization that black golfers formed because they couldn't become members of the PGA, and they had their own schedule and their own tournaments. And Billy was very active in supporting that as well. But individually, it was Charlie Sifford who he found and he kind of adopted and took him in and bankrolled him for 10 years.
I read about Stanley Mosk in getting ready for this chat. Fascinating story. The child of Jewish immigrants, became the AG of California, later sat on that state's Supreme Court. What was his path in California, and why did he decide to be such a champion for Sifford's cause?
Well, he had a long history of experiencing discrimination. He was the only Jew in a class of 400 in his high school. And he was the class president. And on graduation day, he led the students into the auditorium in their gowns and robes and everything. And the band played Onward Christian Soldiers. So he got a kick out of that at the time. But it sort of formed him as he went through his adult life. He went to law school in the University of Chicago, but then had to transfer to another law school in Southern California, which kind of catered to the underserved community. Got his law degree, and then he went into politics, and he became a Democratic activist, I guess you could say. He championed Democratic causes. He spoke at ACLU benefits, and it came quite naturally to him because he was on the bench in 1947 when he ruled that racial covenants could not be enforced in Southern California. And that was a huge decision, which the Supreme Court ruled on the next year and said the same thing that he did. You cannot enforce them. And so he had a real record of civil rights, of championing individual rights. As soon as he took over the AG's office, he expanded it to include the first ever division of constitutional rights. So he was on board, and he hired a black NAACP attorney named Franklin Williams as his lead deputy. And Frank Williams was a big part of this story behind the scenes, fighting for Charlie Sifford and for the end of the Caucasian only clause.
What were some of the things that Sifford had to endure on the golf course, not just from fans, but from people inside the sport?
Well, from people inside the sport, he got no vocal support from any of them that I was able to find. I mean, there were players who were sympathetic to his cause. They sat in the parking lot with him when he couldn't get into the clubhouse to eat or change his clothes. They were able to, give him some golf balls and stuff like that. But nobody, and this is one of the real tragedies, where nobody at that time raised their voice and said, you know what, this is wrong. Charlie Sifford's good enough to be playing golf in the PGA Tour. Charlie Sifford should be playing golf on the PGA Tour. And the only reason he can't is because of the color of his skin. And that's just wrong. And nobody said that. Nobody said that. And that's one of the real tragedies, because he got very, very little support amongst his fellow pros. Outside there, he was getting help from Jackie Robinson and Joe Lewis and Walter Winchell and eventually Stanley Mosk. But from within, very little support amongst his fellow pros. And that's really disappointing.
I'm reminded of the story of Pee Wee Reese and Jackie Robinson, and Reese, allegedly, it's kind of disputed, putting his arm around Robinson to show a public display. And Sifford was a part of a broader civil rights struggle where the nation was forced to confront its history of racial injustice in sports. Sifford broke the color barrier in golf 14 years after Robinson did in baseball. What do you think took so long for that change to occur in golf?
Well, I think golf was a predominantly white sport. Still is, as we see every week on the PGA Tour. So I think that was part of the problem for him. But also, it's just that there was no recourse for him. There was no avenue for him. He came from the UGA was not like the Negro Leagues in baseball. There weren't 25 guys in the UGA good enough and ready enough to become professional golfers in the PGA Tour, if in fact it was if they were able to do so. But mostly it was because golf codified it. Baseball didn't, football didn't. No sport other than golf actually codified racial discrimination. in their bylaws. And that's what took so long. And I think we're a little bit naive to think it would have happened when it did, if not for Stanley Mosk, because in 1960, the PGA affirmed the Caucasian-only clause at its annual convention by a 4-1 margin. So it wasn't inevitable that it was going to drop. It would have at some point, I'm sure of that, but it wasn't inevitable that it was going to go away when it did. And the only reason it went away when it did is because Stanley Mosk brought down the hammer and the power of the California AG's office.
It is relatively easy to compare Jackie Robinson and Charlie Sifford, but my understanding is that Sifford didn't always like that comparison. Why was that?
There were a lot of reasons he didn't like that comparison. One of the reasons was what we just talked about, was that there was no influx of black golfers that came in after him. There were a couple. There was Pete Brown, who won the '64 Waco Turner Open, the first black to win a PGA Tour event, official PGA Tour event. But there were no floodgates to be opened. And he was by himself. He didn't have teammates. He didn't have Pee Wee Reese to throw his arm around him and say, hey, we're good. He didn't have, anybody but him out there. It was him against the world. He didn't have Branch Rickey supporting him. There was none of that. So he had to do it on his own. And back in late 50s, that was not an easy thing to do for a black golfer, because there just weren't many of them.
And it is true that there was not a wave of players that followed him as followed Jackie Robinson. But interestingly, arguably the most significant golfer in the history of the game was significantly influenced by Charlie Sifford. Talk about that.
Well, obviously, Tiger has embraced Charlie Sifford a lot. First, he named his son Charlie after Charlie Sifford. He has said that there doesn't deserve to be a World Golf Hall of Fame if Charlie Sifford's not a member. Charlie Sifford was inducted. He was the first black to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Tiger came after him, and Tiger credits Charlie and Charlie's perseverance and Charlie's enduring all the things he endured to get to where he got to, which enabled Tiger's father maybe to play. And if Tiger's father didn't play, then Tiger probably would never have picked up the game. And so Tiger sort of traces his, golf lineage to Charlie Sifford and the battles that Charlie fought just to be able to play on the tour.
In doing the research for the book, what were some of the most surprising or interesting things that you learned?
Well, I learned an awful lot about Stanley Mosk and his life, because I really didn't know that much about him when we started out. I didn't realize he had the career he had. I mean, he was on the California Supreme Court for 37 years. I also learned that he had a little bit of a dalliance with another woman who was not his wife, and that might have cost him a U.S. Senate seat. And who knows what would have happened, because he probably would have won the Senate race in 1964. And then he might not have gone to the court. We don't know what happened. That's one of the great big ifs. And I just couldn't help but think, as I mentioned earlier, as I was reading about Charlie playing in these tournaments and how he would start the year, he'd play in the LA Open. The LA Open was a great tournament, allowed everybody to play. They didn't care. And then his schedule would just go away. I mean, he couldn't play for 3 or 4 months when the tournament went south. And I'm thinking, how do you make a living that way? And this is where Billy Eckstein came in, and where Joe Louis came in, and they kept supporting them, and they kept paying their way if they could get into a tournament. And they could get into some tournaments in the North. There wasn't a complete blackball. But he couldn't become a member. And the way you got to be a PGA member in those days was that you worked in a pro shop for 5 years, and then you applied for membership, and you got it. And blacks couldn't even do that. So there was really no path for Charlie Sifford or Ted Rhodes or Bill Spiller or any of the good black golfers of that time to get into the PGA. They were completely shut off.
The book is called Changing the Course: How Charlie Sifford and Stanley Mosk Integrated the PGA. Peter May, thanks for the time.
Thank you, Whit. Appreciate it.